This episode of the Paddock Pass Podcast is brought to you by Fly Racing.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass Podcast presented by Fly Racing. On this week's show, we're going to recap the action from the Doha Grand Prix. Steve English, David Emmett, Neil Morrison and Adam Wheeler on today's show. And before we get started, we've got a lot of questions in from our listeners. And there was one question that was probably the most pressing one for us to get to. So we're going straight into it. Neil, we've got a question in from Alex Whitworth. And Alex is asking, what are you and Matt going to talk about on air whenever Matt gets his haircut eventually?
Well, you see, Steve, this isn't a pressing concern because I'm convinced that Matt is never going to get his haircut ever again, judging by his appearance of the last couple of weeks. So, yeah, I think we're just going to keep going with the hair topic for as long as he has it.
No, I'll tell you what, Matt should hold on to it as long as possible. And David, you're very well placed to be able to talk about that.
Oh, yeah, expert, mate. Very, very expert. I'm obviously a big hair guy. Spend a lot of time on mine. Pour a lot of money into product. Product really rules my life.
I remember there was one time actually we were all staying together in Silverstone, and the girl behind reception came up to us. We were all sitting down in the bar, just getting our dinner and a few drinks, and she came up to us and she said, "I'm very sorry, gentlemen, but we've got a shortage of hair dryers in the hotel. Can we take them from your rooms?" And we all looked at disgusted. To be so insulted. And one of the group, I won't comment on who it was, said, "No, you can't have mine. I've got a very hairy back. I need to hold on to my hairdryer." And sure enough, the lovely lady just left us. I'm going to come straight to you though, Adam, at the start of the pod, because I want to ask you for your moment of the Doha Grand Prix.
Goodness, it says a lot that it's hard to pick. We talked about several in our race notes roundup on Sunday evening, straight after the race, Steve. Moment of the Grand Prix. For me, I don't know why, but Moto2 still sticks in my mind. So I'll go for that last lap chase between Remy Gardner and Sam Lowes. There was so much going on, both good and kind of unsavory, I suppose you could say. But that was the pick for me.
Yeah, not a bad pick as well. I thought that was a great battle at the end of the race. A real battle all the way through as well. Relentless pace all the way throughout. David, what about you? What was your moment of the Doha Grand Prix?
I can't even remember what I said on the paddock notes on Sunday night.
It was inspired, Dave. I remember it.
It was. I was up until 5 o'clock in the morning writing me roundup after that. So, but my moment is Pedro Acosta's win because it asks and answers so many questions. Such a talented rider to win in just your second Grand Prix after getting on the podium in your first Grand Prix. KTM's talent pool, and to win from pit lane after getting a penalty. It's fascinating. It's outstanding, and I think it's a historic moment. It's one of those moments you're going to look back on in 10 years as he's on his way to the MotoGP title and remember.
Yeah, we also had that with Romano Fenati in the past and a few other riders. So it's very easy to write their full CV for their career. It's very easy to write what their history is going to be, but they actually have to get the job done on track continuously as well. Acosta started off fantastic though. Second last week, first this week. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens when he goes to Europe as well. But they're all tracks he knows. Neil, what about you? What was your moment of the weekend?
I'm tempted to go with David's choice and say Acosta because that was just, I think everyone had to pick the jaw up off the floor after that race. But I'm going to go with Jorge Martin's weekend just because, the boy delivered. I mean, we were all a little bit skeptical, I think, after he got pole position, which was sensational. Really, really impressive on Saturday. But we thought, maybe he'll get a good start and there'll be a few laps at the front at most. But, the guy was outstanding in the race. I mean, it was a really, really brilliant performance. It wasn't just a kind of a one lap flash in the pan. Like the guy had serious pace. I think he was 19 seconds faster from race 1 to race 2, and led 18 laps like a pro. So yeah, hat off to Jorge Martin. That was, I think, the standout moment of the Doha GP.
What's the reason why none of us are picking Fabio's first win as a factory Yamaha rider? I mean,
you haven't even gotten my view yet, Ad.
Oh, sorry, Steve. Oh, I do apologise if I've ruined your entrance.
No, I wasn't going to pick Fabio anyway.
Well, there you go. Before you give us your moment, is it, was he lucky or was it not particularly, authoritative?
Because we expect him to win. I mean, he's going to win a race. Like he won 3 races last year. Winning as a factory Yamaha rider, especially the week after a factory Yamaha rider won last week, it's not all that. It's not. It's amazing. It's fantastic. It's really good for his championship. All the rest of it, but it's not sort of mind-boggling. It's not completely unexpected. It's not like a 16-year-old winning from pit lane. It's business as usual. It's exactly what you would. Or what you would hope to expect from the factory Yamaha team, which we didn't see last year, and we're seeing this year. So yeah, it's not that it's not amazing or it's not good. It's just that it's very much what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, but Dave, he finished 2020 in a flap. I mean, it was definitely a descent towards the end of the championship, and then there was a few alarming signs already from the first round last week. I mean, maybe they were kind of first race nerves. I don't know, but.
Yeah, but he was close last week. That's the thing. Do you know what I mean? He wasn't nowhere. It's clear that things were working, and also this is a Yamaha track. I think we can sort of safely conclude that. It's a Yamaha track, except when it's a Ducati track. But I mean, there was no surprise to me.
Steve, your weekend moment.
Well, I'll be honest. I wasn't tempted to have Fabio winning as the moment, but I did think it was really cool that we had a French 1-2. I thought that was, the first time it's ever happened. There was something special about that without actually looking at it from the perspective of any of the actual participants or what happened in their races. So I'm actually going to go with that because it was, a historic moment in the championship. So for me, that was pretty cool to see. And I thought, obviously, both riders did very well, and we'll get into that during the course of the pod as well. But before we get into the pod, Ad, you mentioned it just a couple of moments ago about our Paddock Notes show. That's there just for our Patreon supporters. And if you want to become a Paddock Insider on Patreon, you'll get those shows over the course of a race weekend. We've done them for the first 2 rounds of the year to get everyone up to speed. Basically, we come straight off the debriefs, record a show and get it uploaded to Patreon as quickly as possible so everyone's able to get themselves up to date as quickly as possible. And just to give a shout out to a couple of our Paddock Insiders, Michael Jansen and also Alan Nance. So thanks for your support on patreon.com. So boys, let's get straight into it. And I'm going to kick off, Ad, just for you with Fast Fabio and his win. Obviously, a really good performance by Quartararo. We saw that he recovered really well through the race. He looked very composed all the way through, Ad.
Yeah, and you have to contrast his performance to his teammate who won the previous week. I mean, Maverick Vinales, by his own admission, blew the start. His reaction time was too slow. We said in the last podcast after the Qatar Grand Prix, is this a new dawn for Maverick Vinales, or are we going to see some of the old bad habits crop up? And it was a little disappointing to see that he still hasn't found a reliable formula for his race starts. But Quartararo, like we mentioned on the Race Notes podcast, he was one of 2 to 3 riders who were looking very strong at a certain point in the race. Pecco Bagnaia was also pretty quick. Alex Rins had a massive moment, I think, going through turn 8. I can't remember which one it was. But it was also, really, integrated into the group. So I think once Quartararo was the only one who was able to execute that move past Martin, then, he had the race in the bag. It was a big shot for the confidence for him. And then we're obviously going to Portimao, and once we get to Jerez, then he's going to be flying.
Just going to say that I think this was the race that Fabio could have done last week, because there was a moment in race 1 where he looked exceptionally strong. He kind of recovered from a iffy start and basically towed Vinales up towards the leaders, and then he suffered from some rear tire issues. And it's kind of funny how riders describe their race in some occasions. Like last Sunday, Fabio was talking about how he had this rear tire issue, and there was no explanation for it, and he wanted answers, and he couldn't really put his finger on it. And then he told us after the race yesterday, we were recording on Monday, that round 1 was a rookie race from him. Basically, tire conservation had gone out the window. He hadn't even really engaged and changed the engine maps to conserve his tire at certain points in the race, and he had kind of put a bit more thought into this one. He was a bit more composed on the bike, and he was actually able to conserve his tires using the relevant engine maps. So, I think the potential was there for Fabio to do this in race one, and he was great. He was everything that we said about Vinales after race one. I think we could apply the same to Quartararo. He was okay. The first lap wasn't great, but he was composed. His racecraft was good. He was aggressive when he needed to be, and he was able to move and make decisive moves at the right time in order to cap the Ducatis along the main straight, which was no mean feat. So I think it was really strong stuff from Fabio Quartararo. I like the noises that he's making. That he was in this position at the start of last season after 2 successes at Jerez, and then, for want of a better phrase, the arse fell out of it. So I think he's looking pretty good. I think Yamaha are looking pretty good, and one swallow doesn't make a summer, as you say, Steve. But Fabio has to be among the 5 or 6 names that could be champion at the end of this year.
Yeah, and Dave, I want to just ask you a quick question, kind of related to that, because obviously last week we saw Fabio was 5th, yet last night we saw that it was Vinales that was 5th. So both the Yamaha riders, they've come out from the first 2 rounds with the same amount of points, but definitely for Fabio, he's going to feel that he's got that momentum behind him, and not just because of winning at the weekend. It's actually because he learned the lessons from round 1 and really brought them to fruition this weekend.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is about putting it all together, and that's exactly what Fabio did this weekend. And I think also what was so strong about him is he understood where he had to pass. He had the patience to wait for when it was the right time. He waited for the right place to pass. He made sure he could get enough of a gap to basically drop the Ducati and drop Miller Martin. And once he knew that he had enough of a gap, enough of a cushion, then he knew he was safe along the straight, and that was it. So it was just a really, really clever, sensible, well-balanced race, and it was what he needed to do. But I really think, I hope we can talk about this later, but I really think the Yamaha have made a huge step.
Well, I actually just wanted to go straight into that, Dave, because I had a question for Neil, because Neil, you said there that Yamaha look very well placed. That's obviously just factory Yamaha look very well placed, because the Petronas Yamaha team had another really tough weekend, not even looking at Valentino Rossi right now. What actually happened to Franco during the course of the race?
Yeah, it's tough to say, Steve. I don't really think that Franco Morbidelli knew what was going on. I think, David wrote quite eloquently about this in his roundup on Saturday. Qatar is just such a strange track in that the track conditions are so up and down and so kind of random, just with the amount of wind that they have, how much dust has been blown on, or sand has been blown onto the track. The temperature, humidity can all be very different. You only have 1 session a day essentially to work for the race. And Morbidelli just wasn't really able to put his finger on what was going wrong. Also, the kind of the idea that his start device was what affected his the start device not working was what kind of prohibited him in the first race. He said that maybe wasn't even the case. So it was a puzzling 2 weeks for him. He did say he reverted back to his setup from the first kind of part of 2020, and he said that was good, but the sort of the downside of that was tire management wasn't great, and by the end of the race he kind of had no tire left, no rear tire left. And Valentino Rossi was just nowhere all weekend. Shocking qualifying, really bad race at a track where he always excels. Some worrying times for the Petronas boys.
Yeah, Franco's. What was interesting about what Franco Morbidelli was saying, that they'd been going backwards. They'd been basically like discarding items from which they'd been using first of all during the test, and then during the latter part of 2020 when he was so strong, going back all the way to the setup they started last season on, just to try and get a baseline. It means they're a bit lost. I think last week's race really cost them. I think once we get back to Europe, it's going to be much more interesting, be much better. It'll be much more interesting to see what Morbidelli actually starts, what setup he starts Portimao with, because obviously, he had a really, really good race at the end of Portimao at the end of last year. So it's going to be, it's really difficult to tell. And like I wrote, Qatar, you learn so little that it makes it very, very difficult. But when you struggle, you really struggle. Then you're in real trouble, and we saw that with just about everyone.
But it's puzzling why. I mean, I know Morbidelli's on a different model of Yamaha, but it's puzzling why the Petronas guys struggled and the factory guys seemed to have the trick. We saw the closest ever top 15, in MotoGP history. And Dave, you pointed this out on the Race Notes podcast that the riders have had an absurd amount of laps. One particular track over the better part of 10 to 11 days. Why couldn't Valentino Rossi, especially the most experienced rider on the grid, not really get, sorted out? I mean, I think, Neil, you tweeted out on your account today, KTM, manufacturer, have only had 5 Grand Prix at that venue since 2017, made the biggest leap forward. I think their race time was like 19 seconds quicker or something like that compared to race 1. I mean, that was they had made a clear step. So I'm just confused as to why the Petronas Yamaha boys really couldn't find a solution, especially when we know that Yamaha, those 4 motorcycles, probably closest, or they share quite a lot of information. You think Rossi as well, with his links with the factory team, he would know instantly what kind of data Vinales and Quartararo are using.
Just a data point here. So let's see. Franco Morbidelli improved his race time from Qatar 1 by 22.7 seconds. Fabio Quartararo improved it by 7.7 seconds. Maverick Vinales by 2.5 seconds. And Valentino Rossi by 1.1 seconds. So it shows you how much difference. I mean, obviously, Morbidelli had an absolute shocker. So it's not really surprising that in Qatar 1. So it's not surprising that he made such a big leap. And Quartararo went from 5th about, I think, 4 or 5 seconds back to winning, and so that's also a big amount. And this was a really, really fast race. I think the race overall was something like 5 seconds faster than last week. So yeah, it's it's interesting to see that, to put it in perspective of who made such big steps.
Yeah, and it's, we talked about Petronas obviously having a tough time, but it was interesting hearing some of the Ducati riders talk about trying to follow the Yamahas when they came past them out of the final corner in particular. And they said in second and third gear, I mean, the Yamahas were actually gaining on them, actually, pulling out a wee bit. And it was only in fourth, fifth and sixth gear where the Ducatis were making up. I don't think we've been able to say that so much about Yamaha in recent times. And I think this was one of the reasons why when Quartararo did get to the front on Sunday, or when Vinales got to the front a week ago, that they were able to make that gap, because they weren't being totally overwhelmed on the straight. They were obviously being reeled in, but it wasn't like, previous years where we've seen Yamahas just get swamped and drowned. It does look like they've made some real steps with, kind of traction in the lower gears. That has to bode well for the season as a whole.
There was a headwind for both races, but the headwind was much less in the second race. And a headwind, when you've got a lot of top speed, the headwind is much more disadvantageous, because a drag is basically the square of the square of velocity, and so the difference between sort of like 350 and 360, the drag grows up enormously, rather than between sort of say 200 and 210, and that's where the Yamahas were making all of their ground. They were making their grounds making up ground in the low gears, because they could get the drive and they could get the acceleration, whereas the Ducati, the strength, the real weapon of the Ducati is how much faster it is at the end of the straight. But when there's so much more of a headwind, all that extra horsepower doesn't buy them as much extra velocity. So I think the Ducatis were closer this week than they were last week, just because there was less of a wind. But because there was a headwind, that made it a little bit easier for the Yamahas, because that handicaps the Ducatis much more than it handicaps the Yamahas.
Yeah, and Dave, I just want to kind of circle back towards the Petronas boys as well, because we actually did get in, obviously enough, a lot of questions about this over the course of the weekend. And just as a sampling of them, Phil Armstrong and Ole Moto both asked pretty much around the same kind of question of asking what we expect for Rossi going forward, whether or not this is reflective of him. And just before we get into it, I just want to give my thoughts on it as well, because whenever we had our moments of the weekend at the start of the show, I really wanted to say Rossi having the worst qualifying performance of his career was a moment of the weekend. It should be a historical note for us, but it wasn't. It wasn't surprising to see what happened with Rossi. His pace wasn't there all the way through the week. He didn't look like he was going to be able to do much. And even in the run-up to yesterday's race, I was having a chat with a few racers in different championships, and I was asking them, like, what sort of position do you expect for Rossi? What's your over-under on him? And all of them came back with 14th or 15th place was the expectation. Is this what we're going to see from Rossi throughout the course of this year? And if that is the case, obviously enough, this is going to be a farewell tour.
I'll go first if you like. I'll take the bullet.
You jump on that landmine, please, Dave.
Yeah, that's right. I'll jump on it. First of all, it's Qatar and we don't know anything, right? Basically, you don't learn anything from Qatar. If you either go well at Qatar or you struggle at Qatar, and it's really difficult to actually make any improvement. So I don't think this is a good... it's also a track where tyre wear can be really, really crucial. The fact that Valentino Rossi is still struggling with tyre wear, as he has been doing for basically the last 2 years or so, that is a bad sign. But I am withholding judgment until we get to, shall we say, Barcelona, because by then we'll have had... Portimao's a new track, can't really say much about it, but we'll have had Jerez, we will have had Mugello, we'll be at Barcelona. We might have had either Jerez twice, we might have had Barcelona twice. We might even race at Le Mans, who knows? But those are all tracks that he knows. They're tracks that he goes well at. They're tracks that he understands. And so we should have a much, much better idea of where he is. If by the time we get to, say, Mugello or Barcelona, he is still 12th, then I think, this is going to be a farewell tour. Then I think you can write him off. But the Qatar is too weird. That's the trouble. You can't draw any hard conclusions from it.
I think also Valentino's still trying to work out, the best setup still on the M1. He mentioned again struggling with rear grip, rear vibration. He's one of the greatest riders the sport's ever seen, but maybe we have to give him a bit of leeway in changing teams, changing setup, changing personnel. For the first time in his career, or the better part of 15, almost 2 decades, he's not working with the same set of people. I do find it a little, not alarming, but surprising that he's still talking about racing another season or two, even in MotoGP. And I think he'll always justify a place on his team by virtue of his name and his number and his colour alone. But you do have to wonder at what point do brands and race managers, people who are writing the checks, say, well, listen, we prefer a rider that might get us results compared to a guy admittedly who will bring people into the stands. It's a really tricky one, but it's nowhere near the kind of start I think Rossi wanted. He won this Grand Prix, he won at Qatar rather in 2015, so it's not light years away, and to see him so uncompetitive was a bit it was a bit soul destroying actually.
Yeah, and I think it's, like we said in all of our pre-season shows as well, it's easy to forget that Rossi should have won 2 races last year. Could have won 2 races last year. He had some weekends where he had really good pace. You think back to Catalonia, and that was a real opportunity for him. So it is still there for him, but the problem with it is, and we've said it a lot on the show over the last couple of years, MotoGP is too competitive now. Rossi was, I think, 7-8 tenths of a second off the pace of the race leaders for a lot of yesterday, and he was 20th, he was 19th, he was 18th, he was 16th. He wasn't able to make progress because it's that close, it's that competitive. Somewhere around, like Losail, 8 tenths of a second is half a tenth around each corner. He's not given up huge amounts anywhere, but he's given up enough everywhere to be all the way down the field. So it's a small improvement is all that they need, but you're living in MotoGP now, and those small improvements are tough to find.
The problem is, if you are Rossi, what do? Do you kind of make a decision after you've had 4, 5, 6 results finishing outside the top 10? Do you put your hands up and say, I was one of the best ever, but now I'm not good enough? Or do you keep soldiering on and hope that, maybe you'll have a fantastic win at the greatest racetrack of them all, like Assen or Silverstone or something, and then, it's like going out in a blaze of glory?
The cathedral, Adam, I think you mean.
Steve, I'm not even going to respond to that comment.
Honestly, I think because he's always said, "I'm going to wait for the first five or six races." Rossi's best tracks are all in the first half of the year, with the exception of Misano, because he's quite good at Misano as well. Sepang, Philippine, he's been quite good there as well. But like Mugello, he loves Mugello. He loves Barcelona. He's always been fast at Jerez. He loves Assen. Those are the tracks. And if he is qualifying 21st there, if he is finishing 14th. If he finishes 14th at Assen, a long way off the back, then I think it's difficult. And then I also start to think that people are going to say, who do we want next year? Do we want Remy Gardner or do we want Valentino Rossi? I mean, Valentino Rossi's great, but Remy Gardner might actually win you a race.
Yeah, that's fine. But Remy's obviously going to go to Tech 2 to replace Iker Lecuona, Dave, so you can take him off the case. Neil, I want to ask you a question, because if it's too easy to read too much into Rossi's performance in Qatar, it's not a big enough sample space. Is it far too early to read too much into Jorge Martin's performance? And I'm coming to you because you obviously picked Jorge Martin's pole as your moment of the weekend.
I mean, yes and no. Like, basically what David said about Qatar, you can apply that to all the riders. It's not really a good gauge, but at the same time, it's really not very common that rookies score podiums in the first handful of races. Martin's the first guy to score a MotoGP podium in one of his first two races since Marquez in 2013. I mean, that's saying quite a lot. And it wasn't just like a podium. It was the manner in which he rode all weekend that I found so impressive. 19 seconds from one week to the next is seriously, seriously good. He rode like a rookie in his first race and got too excited and burnt up his rear tire, yet there was absolutely none of that evident as he led the race. And as David said, it was a fast race. I think it was 5 seconds faster from race 1 to race 2. Zarco was saying how he was kind of amazed. We was like, well, we're doing low 55s. I kept expecting him to drop away. Martin said this, and it's okay to say this, obviously, after the event, but, had it not been his teammate in front, he would have, definitely tried for a kind of a retribution move, or he would have tried to respond at the final corner. So, it could have been a second place. I think it was seriously impressive. The fact that he outperformed Bagnaia and Miller in only his second Ducati race is seriously impressive. Yeah, Qatar is a weird place with weird conditions, but I think this definitely says a lot about how Jorge Martin is going to perform in MotoGP.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really going out on a limb here, but I think it says more about what he's going to be like in his second year rather than his first year, because, they've been there for 11 days. They've been riding there for 11 days. They've got their, the number of laps they've gone around there are counted in orders of magnitude. They're almost in the millions of kilometers around there. So he has had time to understand fully how to ride a MotoGP bike around Qatar, and he rode it outstandingly, just superbly. Because, like you say, he was 55s all the way through the race, only dropping off to the high 58s at the end. Again, what was impressive about Quartararo's win is that at the end he's doing 55.1s and 55.2s, which is really, really fast. So I think he did. It was an outstanding race. He had everything fell into place for him. The pole lap was really breathtaking. I think there's what you saw was his potential. This is his potential. I think next year, I'm really looking forward to seeing him next year, but I fully expect him to get to maybe a track like Portimao, where he doesn't have the time around it on a MotoGP bike, and where he doesn't really know the track so well, and to struggle quite badly because you've got to get your head around something very, very different. Also, maybe Jerez, because Jerez on a MotoGP bike, especially a Ducati, is so much more difficult than a track like Qatar. But he was incredibly impressive in this race, and it showed that this was his potential. But it's still only a second race. It is still only a second race in MotoGP. There is so much more to learn, and I think he's going to spend the rest of the year learning it.
Yeah, I think Dave's spot on there. I mean, while it was an impressive feat, I think we have to, also calm down a little bit because, he's racing. It was the last day of action at the only track where he's ridden a MotoGP bike. You think he would know, even though of course he's a rookie, it's still an ideal scenario. I mean, it was half decent weather conditions and, he had countless laps on that bike at that track. Once we do get to some more idiosyncratic kind of courses, some very diverse different challenges in terms of layout, grip, whatever else, then that's where you'll see how much of a talent, Martin is on a MotoGP machine.
Honestly, I think he's going to do really well at Mugello. I'm quite interested to see how he does at Mugello because it seems like the way he was riding, that seems to, I think that will suit Mugello. The lean angles, who's getting the corner speed he was carrying, that's really going to suit Mugello. And it would be interesting to see. Maybe let's speculate. Maybe we get Bagnaia versus Martin at Mugello for the win, and that would be, for a start, very, very entertaining.
I mean, we all know there's so much more to it, don't we? I mean, we were singing Quartararo's praises at the start of last season. After that double win, it looked like nobody was going to touch him. Not mention any names, Neil Morrison. So it's, and then ultimately Fabio descended down the standings and finished 8th in the championship. I mean, Jorge Martin has yet to be tested in a political sense in the team because his teammate is now leading the championship. He's also to be tested in terms of where his future might lie. There's all sorts of little pressures that are going to come at him. So let's hang on before we start hailing the new Marc Marquez.
Yeah, and just before we go on, I would like to point out that a certain someone that's on this call tried to pull my blog after I bigged up Fabio Quartararo in 2019, and he hasn't gone on to do too badly. Someone was saying, "Oh, it's just a flash in the pan." So, touche, Mr. Wheeler.
I think it's interesting to see, while Adam's talking about the political nature that Jorge Martin has to now try and understand how to wade through, that Neil Morrison immediately at ease to wade straight into that with one of his editors. So that's quite impressive, Neil. But I'm going to ask you a quick question as well, Neil, because it comes back to the team tactics that we saw with Pramac. And we got a couple of questions in, and one of the questions we got in was from Gooseyard, and he was wondering just how often do we see teamwork like we saw from Pramac during the course of this race? Because after the race, Zarco was talking about how he basically wants to hold up Alex Rins so that Jorge Martin was able to stay out in front and try and open up a bit of a gap. Obviously, Zarco would have felt that he could bridge that gap quite easily, but he was working as a rear gunner despite being the presumed team leader.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't make up the gap that easily. It only took him, it took him until the penultimate corner of the race to actually get close enough to Martin to make a move. But I mean, we've seen this in previous seasons with Ducati riders in particular. I mean, Petrucci, when he moved into the factory team alongside Dovizioso, those guys were working together and they were conducting tests and free practice sessions basically behind one another to see if they could eventually play together in the race. But I think, Zarco's comments that you mentioned there, Steve, just shows what a kind of a clever, intelligent rider Zarco is, and maybe a guy that can fight for the championship this year, because he was just thinking how he can use the situation in a race to his advantage. And there's a guy that hasn't looked flustered at all so far this season in testing or in the races. And he said himself on Sunday evening, he still feels there's a lot more to come from him on this bike. So I think that was a sign of Zarco's intelligence, how he was using his teammate up ahead. I mean, we don't see it a lot, but there have been occasions, certainly in the past. Yeah, most notably, I would say, with the factory Ducati guys a few years ago.
I mean, you do use this sort of team tactics to your advantage. You actually see it a lot in Moto3. You will see the riders going out to help each other during qualifying, which is and practice to set a fast time, which is really, really smart. And we've seen it in MotoGP a few times. The first thing you want to do is get rid of the opposition. So if you can get rid of the opposition by holding them up, but it's also a sign of the confidence which Zarco had in his own ability. Was like, okay, if I can get rid of Rins, hold him up, then I don't have to worry about him. And my rookie teammate, I can get past him. That's not going to be an issue. So it's that kind of thinking. it's that I think it's a sign that he's not afraid of Jorge Martin yet. That might change in the future, but usually, I mean, you can always tell riders are always nice to other riders they're not afraid of. So we'll see how that plays out in the end. I mean, we've seen it so often that Valentino Rossi, Marc Marquez, they've been very, very complimentary towards other riders, and then all of a sudden those riders turn out to be as fast as them, and then all of a sudden they're not quite as friendly to them.
It's also worth pointing out as well, I think Zarco obviously proved his speed and his capabilities on the Yamaha. So he's jumped from a V into an inline four with, the other way around with the Ducati. He's had a year to acclimatise, and now he's really probably I can't think of any other rider who's really switched between those two kind of engine technologies and really excelled. I mean, Zarco's already been on the podium and now leading the championship. So it's a good sign for him.
I think there's a difference. He's one of the few to go from a Yamaha to a Ducati. He was hopeless on the KTM. He was okay on the Honda, but the Honda was quite a difficult bike to ride still. But
that was only 3 races.
Well, yeah, also. I think also it's the Ducati seems to be the second easiest bike to ride. The Yamaha seems to be the easiest bike to ride. You can get on it, you understand it, it'll do what you want. You can understand how to make it go faster. The Ducati is a bit like that because we've seen rookies. I mean, Bagnaia in his first year had some glaring problems, some glaring weaknesses, but he was able on occasion to actually get up to speed quickly. Whereas if you look at people jumping onto the Honda straight away, then it takes them a while to actually get their head around it. I think we haven't often seen someone go from a Yamaha to a Ducati, and I should imagine that someone like Fabio Quartararo or Maverick Vinales have half an eye on Johann Zarco and thinking, okay, right, so maybe it's not as difficult as for example, Jorge Lorenzo's excursion to Honda. Because I mean, we saw with Lorenzo as well, who was the archetypal Yamaha rider, the corner speed rider. He got on a Ducati and he was sort of okay for the first year, but once they sorted out his problems and he fixed a few of his riding, a few things in his riding style, he was dominating. He was, he looked capable of winning a championship. It's just that Ducati had, for some reason, Claudio Domenicali had decided he didn't want Jorge Lorenzo taking any more of his money. And it was a large amount of money, to be fair.
A lot of it might have been down to the fact that Jorge was obviously much more stylish as well than Domenicali, and that was a big factor. But let's move from that straight into the factory Ducati team as well now, guys. We got a question in from Andy Mast, and he's asking, why do the factory Ducati team never quite meet their expectations?
I think it says a lot about the atmosphere inside the Ducati team, inside the factory Ducati team. The pressure has always been enormous. I mean, we've seen it in the past. We saw it with, it's amazing that Andrea Dovizioso managed to stay there for a long time. The expectations are huge. The advantage of being in a satellite team is when you fail, it's not so bad. Like, no one's going to, if you don't win the championship in a satellite team, no one worries about it. Whereas if you're in a factory team and you don't win the championship and you don't win a race, the pressure is absolutely enormous. And Ducati has a reputation for being, one big family when we win. Look, we won a race, and not the complete opposite when you lose, rider. Why did you lose this race? So it's a completely different sort of atmosphere, and you have to be able to get your head around that. Some riders are good at it. I think a lot of riders struggle with it, but it's just the way that you have to manage. And I think it's easy to fail.
Dave, you don't work for Ducati, do you? Because you were scaring me a little bit there.
Claudio Domenicali's got to retire sometime.
Yeah, and you're not stylish enough to worry him as well, Dave, or Paolo for that matter.
Yeah, Claudio could never match Dave's headgear style that we see during race weekends. But yeah, I think that, the same could be said of most factory teams. I imagine the Repsol Honda team is not exactly like a nice Sunday walk in the park. But yeah, just to kind of echo what Dave said, there is a serious amount of pressure, and you do get the impression that there is a genuine belief from certain Ducati engineers that that is the best bike, and that is a bike that is capable of winning the championship. And if you're not regularly winning races, then you have underperformed. And I think that's probably quite apparent with Pecco Bagnaia and Jack Miller, how they're feeling right now, after that race on Sunday, because Bagnaia, I think, had certainly the potential to be on the podium again. Didn't do it. He said, he made a mistake braking for turn 1 and lost a couple of positions. He said, that's unacceptable, that kind of mistake in my current situation. And Miller, I know there were sort of there were factors involved in his 2 9th places, but again, he was expected to win at least one of these races. Probably he was expected to finish on the podium in both of them. This is a real test for him, how he bounces back from this.
Yeah, we were definitely guilty of that as well, because in the lead up to, our season previews and the lead up to the first round of the year, we talked up what Miller could do in Qatar and didn't live up to those expectations. And, it was interesting what sort of happened. But I think for me, one of the things that's interesting, and Dave, you touched on it there whenever you said about the satellite team always has less pressure. For some reason, people still think Pramac are an underdog. Pramac has effectively the same bikes as what the factory team has. The days of Danilo Petrucci putting it on the podium and the press release going out saying we had a podium, that was it. They're long gone. Ducati expect Pramac to get good results. Pramac are under that pressure now as well. But we all still remember the fun-loving days of Pramac, and now they are shifting into a very different team.
But then let's not also forget, it wasn't a complete disaster from Jack Miller's perspective. I mean, he did head. Yeah, he came out of the tests as the guy. I mean, everybody, I'm sure there's a lot of people who play the MotoGP fantasy manager game and put Jack Miller in straight away. Like he pointed out, in his debrief yesterday, there was kind of an interesting chat, mainly for the incidents with Joan Mir, which we'll probably talk about later. But, he was only 5 seconds off the race winner. But what is concerning for me is that now Miller's talking about having an R-pump operation in Barcelona, even possibly before Portimao. So you do kind of think, it's like Dave was saying, the pressure, you go from being, the guy who's heavily favourite to win in Qatar to suddenly being a few incidents, a few things happening, a few miscalculations perhaps with tyre choice or incidents with tyre selection that doesn't work out for you. And then suddenly it's not looking all quite so rosy.
Yeah, and you mentioned that incident between Miller and Mir. We're going to talk about that after the break on the Paddock Pass podcast. But before we go to a break, we actually got an update from Michael Laverty on his thoughts on the Doha Grand Prix. And I'll do Emlav a big disrespect. I'm just going to call him a pundit now, and that'll annoy him no end. So let's hear from BT Sports' Michael Laverty. Of course, Emlav, plenty of experience on the MotoGP field and lots of experience on a superbike as well.
Obviously, one of the big talking points after the MotoGP race was the Mir versus Miller clash. And actually, I see it a little bit different from the majority. A lot of people have been blaming Jack, but obviously there was the first contact when Mir hit Jack, and he hit him at the back of the leg. So it was quite a late move, and it obviously pushed Jack off track. So he penalised Jack by that move. And then they coming onto the start straight. Mir had went deep into the final turn, followed Rins in there, and he was coming back onto line. Yes, Jack may have been able to see him, but where people think it's dirty, but Jack's bike was upright and he actually met Mir handlebar to handlebar, so they were alongside. So what Jack did was actually tried to squeeze Joan out, tried to penalise him for that mistake, tried to make him have to roll the throttle, because the track kind of goes a little bit wider at the outside and then almost narrows into that point where you go to the green. So Jack was leaving him no room, so he had to roll the throttle, which he's entirely justifiable. That's okay to do that in the race. So he was squeezing him out. Side by side, it's up to Mir at that point, because he's made the mistake and he's coming back onto the race line to be aware of the possible overtake from the inside. So both guys, at that point it becomes a racing incident. They can both see each other out of their peripheral. Jack didn't need to give it up, and he wasn't at an angle. I would have said if he did almost came at Mir with the bike still at an angle that was opening the throttle to run into the side of him, as some people suggest. He was dead upright, and he made contact, and it's only the width of the fairing that then caused Jack's front wheel to kick out, and then obviously he leant left and went into the side of Mir, and that caused them both to lose time. So yeah, for me, I don't really apportion blame. Obviously I know Joan's quite annoyed, which is quite normal. Every racer's done it where they feel aggrieved and they only look at it from their point of view, and they will attack the offending rider. So yeah, in a few years' time when he looks back, he'd probably think it actually wasn't that bad from Jack's point of view. So yeah, it's a racing incident, and it's great that it gets everyone talking, but I have no problems whatsoever. I don't think it was dirty by from Jack's side. It was harsh, but it was fair, and he was completely entitled to do it, to hang Joan out, to penalise him for the mistake. And yes, that was because Joan made contact with him earlier in the race, so that is racing. Looking at Moto 2, obviously an absolute masterclass from Sam Lowes at how to manage pressure from Remy Gardner throughout the race, and Sam is on such good form at the moment. And then looking at Pedro Acosta in Moto 3, what a boy from pit lane to win the race and just keep that momentum throughout the field. As he caught them, he didn't slow down for anyone. So impressed with his performance. That kid's got such a bright future.
Fly Racing believes that our most important obligation is to provide the highest performing products to riders worldwide. Offering both on and off-road products for every price range, Fly Racing is committed to reshaping expectations. Fly Racing revolutionized the off-road world with the Formula helmet, featuring Rheon technology. Visit flyracing.com and at FlyRacingUSA on Instagram to learn more about the innovation that can keep you protected in 2021.
Welcome back to the Paddock Pass Podcast presented by Fly Racing. We just heard from Michael Laverty about the incident between Joan Mir and Jack Miller. But Dave, what was your thoughts on what we saw on track?
I found it really interesting what Emlav said. He gave me a perspective which I hadn't had. And he is right. The fact is that Mir was wide and coming back onto the track, and Miller was just sitting there on the track. So he had priority, if you like. But it's quite clear, if you look, you can see Miller look over on the exit of the corner. You can see Miller look over at Mir, and he was looking for Mir. He was looking for this. So he sought out the conflict. Now, Mir's move up into turn 10 was very poor judgment. He didn't get past. I can imagine the frustration. I think Miller, Miller's move was right on the very limit. I would be tempted to give him a penalty, except for the fact that, by those two coming together like that, they both punished each other. They both got in each other's way. They lost a lot of ground, and it ended both of their chances of a decent result. And so it's not really surprising.
Dave, you mentioned there that Mir into turn 10, that move. What way did you see that then? Because for me, looking at the onboards on MotoGP.com, you can see that coming through the right-hander, Mir carries so much more speed than Jack that basically he has no choice but to try and attack. Miller tries to answer back, but he's on the wrong part of the track to be able to actually defend the position. So Mir's already in a position to try and attack, and he has to go for it. He's got no choice. If he doesn't try and attack into 10, he's got no chance about being able to stay in front of Miller. And I think that, this seemed to be the moment that kind of clouded Jack as well, where obviously he feels that he's probably taking his normal line, his normal approach, and then suddenly there's a Suzuki there, but that's because the Suzuki's able to get into that position.
There are two places you can really pass, especially on the Yamaha or on the Suzuki. It's where you saw them turn 6 and turn 10, the two left-handers, because you can carry enough speed out of the corners preceding them to actually dive up the inside and then get past. And also, once you were past, there was enough corners between that and the straight to actually get away. So Mir had to make a move there. His error was not getting far enough ahead, because he got his front wheel sort of level with the back of Miller's front wheel, but he didn't get his front wheel ahead of him. And Miller tried to close the door because he didn't know, or he was trying to prevent Mir from getting past. But they were all together. So it was that one was, I wouldn't say 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It was about sort of 3 Miller and 9 of Mir. But it was truly a racing incident. Mir tried to move and didn't get far enough ahead. Miller's move looked a little bit more intentional. The one thing is, Jack said that he was, he'd been touched 3 or 4 times beforehand. There'd been lots of contact. I was looking and I couldn't see where that might have been, and I'm not even sure that it was between him and Mir. I think there was just lots and lots of sort of niggles and people going backwards and forwards and people touching each other. And Miller was getting more and more frustrated with his position. He couldn't go forward, and Joan Mir ended up being on the sort of receiving end, and perhaps to an extent deserving to be on the receiving end.
I wouldn't say he was deserving to be on the receiving end, because that was pretty combative stuff, especially where it happened as well. It's a pretty dangerous place for that to happen. I think the fact that Miller didn't even deny that it was intentional, that his excuse or his justification for what happened was that, I'd been roughed up a couple of times, like everyone had seen the race and everyone had seen a few of the things that had happened to me. At least he was being honest about it. But he didn't deny that he was kind of intentionally seeking Mir out. And I think, it's pretty dangerous. I saw something that Matt Oxley wrote. He said that in his eyes, Miller was maybe just trying to clip him ever so slightly. And the fact that Mir was kind of turning back into the track caught Miller off guard, and they ended up coming together more than he thought. Maybe he wanted just a little warning to brush by him. But it was clear that he was raging at that point, that he was quite angry. It ended up costing both of them.
Yeah, we actually see that a lot in Moto 2 and in particular, and a bit of Moto 3 as well, where riders will use their elbows an awful lot to just kind of nudge away, as opposed to just trying to lunge with a bike. So you tend to see it where they'll just lift an elbow every now and then, and it just puts that little bit more pressure on the other rider. For me, it was one of those instances where Jack was more interested in giving retribution rather than thinking about the race result, which is fair enough. That's what happens when the red mist comes down. I said it on Paddock Notes last night. I don't think a penalty would have been fair. I think it's one of those things that is a racing incident, but it's on the limit and something that does need to be looked at. I thought it was interesting with what MLav said, because it's impossible to argue with it, but I also didn't agree fully with it. There's nothing better than an argument where everyone can actually be correct. And this is one of those kind of arguments. And it's quite strange whenever you get something like that. But Dave, that's the definition of a racing incident, when, it's not really about apportioning blame.
Yeah, exactly. Like I say, listening to MLav actually changed my mind, because Mir is basically off track and Miller is taking up the position. And, it's like merging onto a motorway. You always have the option to roll off. Mir had the option to roll off, but he was never going to roll off. And Miller saw that and could easily... he could have let him. All he had to give him was a meter, and it would have made no difference to Miller's sort of speed onto the straight. But absolutely no way that Miller was going to roll off either. So it was just two people sort of at loggerheads, really. I think it was much more red mist on the part of Miller, but it wasn't it wasn't an overt crime. It was, in a way, it was sort of reminiscent of some of the crimes of Valentino Rossi, where he managed to do sort of some fairly cheeky things while making it look entirely legitimate.
How dare you, Dave? How dare you? Because apparently now Brad Binder is the ultimate sinner in the eyes of Valentino Rossi. For me, I just think it was a bit of payback by Jack, and I think you just have to look at his reaction immediately after the contact, as if to say, "Well, you screwed me, mate, so have some of it back." Miller was extremely frustrated and demonstrative after his first Grand Prix when he came back into the pits. There was a bit of emotion, a bit of anger there. And I think this just added to the sign that he is under the cosh, as we mentioned in the factory Ducati team. And now the fact that he's seeking to have arm pump surgery because he lost feeling in his right hand with 4 or 5 laps to go, points to the fact that, maybe Jack is searching for something.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those instances as well, lad, where we can't laud Grand Prix riders and motorcycle racers for being gladiators, for being combative, for being all these great adjectives that we like to put into stories, and then give out a little one whenever something like this happens. I think it's one of those instances that you chalk down and you take a note of it, and then if Miller does something again later in the season, you kind of say, well, hang on a second, there's a pattern developing here. But in isolation, I think it's one of those that you just kind of write off a little bit. But it's interesting that it happens this week as well, because Jack's under pressure. We talked about it just before the ad break there, where he came to Qatar expecting to win Grand Prix. He's still looking for that first dry weather win. He would have thought 2 races in Qatar, that's a monkey off my back, I can move on to Europe. And instead, he finds himself with 14 points. Marc Marquez comes back next round in all likelihood, and he's only got 14 points cushion to Marquez. Like, after Qatar, you want to have a big points cushion. You want to be like Johan Zarco with a 40-point advantage over Marc Marquez.
Yeah, and you see into Pramac Ducatis on the podium at a track where for the last 7 years it's been a Yamaha or Ducati winning the Grand Prix. Again, like we said, after the test, all eyes were on him. So, I'm sure it wasn't a very easy flight home for Jack Miller.
Yeah, and I think you just have to contrast his performances to Zarco. I mean, Zarco looks like a more complete rider at this point on the Ducati than Jack, and Zarco has 2 years less experience on the Ducati than Jack. So, yeah, I mean, this is not to say that I don't think this is something Jack can't recover. I still expect him to go well. He had a podium at Portimao last year, really good podium. He's always been really good at Le Mans. You wouldn't bet against him winning the French Grand Prix this year in the next couple of races. So there are good opportunities for him to come back and come back soon. Yeah, I would still say that, Zarco is kind of like the template for, how the Ducati could be in its kind of best form at Qatar, and Miller kind of fell below that.
Yeah, and Neil, you mentioned there about we go to Portimao next. It was a good weekend last year for Jack Miller. It was a great weekend last year for Miguel Oliveira and KTM. But we actually had a great race from KTM yesterday as well. We had Brad Binder able to finish inside the top 10, made massive strides forward from one Qatar race to the next.
Yeah, I mean, a vastly reduced race time. It helped that the KTM's gambled on the medium tyre set. But for Binder's case, I mean, there were the notable achievements there. He made a fantastic start as well, which was something that Pecco Bagnaia, for example, like Neil said, cost him his chance of a good race. But also making up 10 positions, finishing 8th. I mean, the previous best for KTM was in 2019, a 12th position with pole. So it's, as we said before, traditionally, Dessau is not a strong track for the KTMs. They just don't have enough experience and race mileage to be able to get that motorcycle working around the, sort of the flowing trajectory the track has. Miguel Oliveira, he should have been in the mix also. I mean, what a start he had. I think he was 4th. 3rd to 4th around the first couple of turns. But then he said that, his dashboard malfunctioned, so he couldn't even see any of the information. He actually switched towards the end of the race into a fuel saving map. So that also inhibited his performance. And then also he lost the shifting lights. And it was very interesting what he said afterwards, actually, because he was trying to remember the optimum time to shift the bike just from memory. Again, because they've done so many laps around Losail in the last couple of weeks. But when he got back to the pit garage and consulted with his technicians, he saw that every time he was shifting, he was missing the mark. And of course, like we said in MotoGP, if you're slightly off in terms of, making the motorcycle work to a 100% or 110%, because I know Dave loves that kind of saying, then, you're going to be struggling.
It's interesting that some riders actually don't use those shift lights as much. They actually prefer to work to the sound. They go by the sound. And others, I mean, it's also interesting that Oliveira is a big fan, or wants to see the lights because he's a much more analytical kind of a rider. So maybe that, or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. But I certainly find that really interesting that he feels that he needs to see the lights, and other riders are just playing it by ear and playing it by feel.
Yeah, I think that the most famous example of that was Danny Pedrosa. He always eschewed using a digital readout. He always wanted to have an analog speedo, and it's an analog rev counter and different things like that. He wanted to have all those things that he was just accustomed to, things he was used to seeing. It was easier for him to understand when's the right point to shift, because you're looking at it come up towards the very limit, and different things for different riders. It was impressive by Oliveira though that he was able to finish within 9 seconds with all these problems, and impressive the KTM after 10 days found a solution, and it was by taking a gamble and using the medium tires, because during the course of testing Brad Binder tried the medium tire and it was disastrous for him.
Yeah, he had 3 crashes, and he said that each crash was just a front washing out without any warning or any kind of signs of pushing. So, I think it really spooked them. Oliveira said they tried the tire, they knew it was safe, but they didn't know how well it would perform. The KTMs weren't going to get anywhere with a soft tire. Binder actually said on 2 qualification runs, the rubber was already gone. So that was not really an option either. And of course, the hard, was, you might as well have chucked it in the bin outside the back of the pit. So, the medium was a gamble. And, KTM are kind of left with their tails up, because now they're going to a racetrack where they know their package works.
The hard is, the hard tires are only there because of Qatar's stupid schedule, where they have to do practice in the day. So that means that Qatar has got that Michelin has got to bring these hard tires, which only work when the sun is shining and track temperature is 40 something. But they're completely useless at night once the track is, 25, something like that. So yeah, it's the whole Qatar exercise is a very peculiar and unique exercise, and a waste of time for everyone else.
The crazy time schedule of Qatar. I can see Neil already thinking to himself, Dave, I don't want to go back to 5 a.m. finishes to the day. I don't want to be back in college anymore. This is going to be disastrous. But Neil, just to keep you awake over in Qatar, because you're still out there, I want to ask you about Aprilia, and I want to ask you about Aleix, because he leaves Qatar with, two good race weekends. He's 8th in the World Championship, but do you think our Aprilia also going to be thinking, you know what, this is a missed opportunity? We had better pace than what we end up with points-wise.
In one respect, yes, they did have better pace than results-wise. However, it's just one of those things where in a kind of leg race with so many Ducatis in the lead group, I think Aprilia was always going to lose out in that situation. Aleix was saying that his bike was performing really well. He was really happy with the front stability in the race once again. But he just said 4th, 5th and 6th gears, he was just hopeless against the Ducatis, and then that's not serious criticism of Aprilia, because, they're not alone in that regard. He was up there, I think, running as high as 3rd at one point, and then lost out a little bit in the closing laps. But, if you look at the race times, Aprilia were 5.9 seconds off the race winner at round 1, 5.3 seconds off the winner at round 2. For a much changed bike, I think they've done pretty well. I think Aleix rode 2 pretty good races as well. He didn't do anything rash. Managed to keep his composure through both weekends. And it was just the fact that this is a track with a humongously long straight that is always going to suit some of the faster bikes in a kind of scrap that we saw. And I'm really eager to see just how good they will be when we get to Portimao and Jerez, because Aleix was certainly saying that he thinks this bike could be a top 5 bike in a place with a less or with a shorter long straight.
Specifically because of the aero package which they've used. They're using this high drag aero package, which really helps with the wheelie, but you really pay a lot in top speed. By the time you get to the end of the straight, then you're starting to lose out on speed, because it's keeping the, but it's really helping them accelerate out of corners much better. So yeah. I was going to point out, Aleix actually finished closer to the front at the end of or closer to the winner at the end of the second race. So things are looking very, very positive, and I'm really interested to see how it will go around Jerez, for example. I think that's going to be a much, much better measure of where the Aprilia stands at a classic European track.
Don't forget also with Andrea Dovizioso jumping on the bike, the Aprilia is really one to watch. Aleix was being asked about this, wasn't he, over the weekend? And, when trying to stress that he was a top level rider, he didn't need anybody coming into the team to motivate him. But what Dovi contributes to that project, what his feedback is straight away, and what kind of effect it can have on the motorcycle is, something to really watch over the next month or two.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to seeing two fast riders on that bike, two equally fast riders. That would be great. I mean, we've talked about this before. I don't know whether Savadori will stay on that bike or not, but, anyone would rather see Aleix Espargaro and Andrea Dovizioso on that bike than Aleix Espargaro and Lorenzo Savadori, or Bradley, but Bradley Smith as well, because Bradley Smith needs a lot more time to get back up to speed.
Two equally fast riders, Dave. Dovi is not on a par with Aleix and shouldn't be compared to him unless he suddenly lost a massive amount over the course of the winter, because Dovi's a guy that's been able to challenge for world championships. He's been able to win a lot of races, loads of podiums, world champion as well, don't forget, in the 125 class, really went toe-to-toe with Lorenzo on a lesser bike in the 250 class. He is that quality rider that Aprilia need. Aleix has got the speed, there's no doubt about that, he's a very fast rider, but Dovi's got that for the full season as well, and that's what's going to be important if Aprilia are going to make a step.
Well, let me rephrase that, but perhaps not two equally fast riders, but rather Aleix Espargaro and a rider that's faster than him, rather than Aleix Espargaro and a rider that's slower than him.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting with Aprilia because, pace is only useful if you can use it. And Aprilia weren't in a position to be able to use it, but they have made a clear step. That's a massive progress for them, and that's really interesting. Let's finish off before we get just a couple of questions from another few listeners. I want to ask you pretty quickly about Honda. Dave, you take this one. What was your thoughts on Honda for this weekend?
Again, I think they have a lot of work to do. The LCR was a complete mystery because both Alex Marquez and Taka Nakagami seemed to be doing their best to use up as much of Lucio Cecchinello's parts budget as possible. So it's really difficult to say. Again, like the KTMs, the Hondas really need a stronger front tyre. They didn't take the gamble and try to use the medium. It would have been interesting to see what they could have done if they'd have done that. Pol Espargaro doesn't have the experience with the bike to be able to understand the risks that he's taking. But, like Pol had a reasonable weekend. They had, if you had to give them a mark, it would be sort of, somewhere between a C and a C minus, like they were good enough. But that was it. But again, we will see what happens when they get back to Europe. And that is without Marc Marquez. I don't think you can sort of say anything about Marc Marquez because Marc Marquez is is a special case. So yeah, I want to see what they can do once they get back to Europe, to places which are not so unique.
Yep, and I would just like to add, I think, I would maybe give Paul a B- in his first couple of weekends with Repsol Honda. I think there's tremendous potential there. But, the mistake, obviously, I think two mistakes at turn one in the second race cost him big time. I would just like to say, though, that I thought, Paul was getting way too kind of emotional. I know that's something that we kind of know.
Have you met Pol Espargaro before?
Yes, David. Yes, I have met Pol Espargaro before, Dave, but I've also met Pol Espargaro when he's, 1 or 2 years into a project and things aren't going well, and he's, perfectly entitled to get emotional, but he's in his second race, and, on Saturday, he was properly like having a bit of a moment, like we're totally lost, everything's not working, and, on the verge of crying. And it was like, mate, this is not a good track for Honda. You have to just, suck it up and, you'll get to better tracks. And to be fair to him, he recovered and rode really well on Sunday. But it was just one of those instances where you just thought, you shouldn't be putting this amount of emotion. Well, you should be obviously emotionally invested into this. But you shouldn't be getting as emotional as you are right now, because there are a lot of factors that are working against you. Inexperience with the bike and the track being one of them.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other rider on the grid who had more pressure on his shoulders than Pol Espargaro. Like Danilo Petrucci pointed out, only him and Pol are the two riders on the grid riding new bikes. There was a big challenge ahead of them. And, as we said, Pol is prone to, massive highs and big lows. But, he only finished 6 seconds off the race winner, which, he would have been telling everybody about if he was riding the KTM. So, maybe that shows how he shifted his expectations for 2021. But, the Honda's won one Grand Prix in Losail since 2011. So, like Neil said, it's not a Honda track. So, calm down, Pol, your time will come.
Well, let's just look at some of our questions from our listeners as well. We've got a question in from Berto Pinero, and what Berto's asking is whether or not Tech 3 are already at a point where they have to look at making changes for next season in terms of their rider lineup. If so, do you see two riders changing, or did Petrucci show you something to give you a bit of hope this weekend? And who would you like to see put onto that bike? So, Neil, you jump in if you want.
Hey, go to Adam for this one, Steve.
Okay, Adam, you go in then.
I would say Petrucci.
Let's go to David.
Petrucci showed great signs. I mean, let's not forget he pushed up to 4th in the horror show that was, I think, FP3 on Saturday. There's no way you can judge him this early on the RC16. As for Iker Lecuona, I know he's got a lot of credit with the brand and also the team purely because of his age. But like we said, I think in our previous show, perhaps Lecuona and Taka Nakagami are the two riders this year that really have to show something to justify their seats in the class. It's a good question, because if you look at the results, Iker crashed out as well on Sunday. There will be questions about Tech 3 and their rider lineup, but one, it's maybe too early to judge for this season. Another one, it might be a little bit too early to judge, full stop.
Yeah, I mean, it's Qatar. Qatar is a terrible track for KTM. Even the factory KTMs didn't do well. I did think that Petrucci made a big step, which he needed to do in the second race. I think we'll know much more once we get to other tracks. It is only the second race. You can't tell anything because it's Qatar, so that is a bit early. However, just look at KTM's talent pipeline. It's amazing. Remy Gardner, Raul Fernandez, who is just astonishing as a rookie, Pedro Acosta,
Jaume Masia.
Jaume Masia. Right. I mean, they are running out. They don't have enough MotoGP bikes. That's the trouble. There's just not enough room for riders. I mean, is there... maybe you wouldn't put Pedro Acosta on a MotoGP bike, but if you did, you would still have, surprisingly high expectations for him. There's all of them, both.
Hold the bus here, Dave.
16-year-old. Dave.
Yeah, I know he's a 16-year-old, but I mean, it is
two
clear
races,
he has
Dave. 2 races. He's not a MotoGP rider yet, Dave.
No, he isn't. But
you can
medicine. Start to think. But you can start to think like, okay, right, he's starting off on the right foot. You can see that 2-3 years time, you might need a slot in the in KTM for him. You have to start planning for those things.
Romano Spinardi 2012, Dave.
Yeah, but
Chan Onchu, Valencia.
Yeah, but Pedro Acosta.
Of course, he was also a KTM, right? Why is he in World Supersport, Dave? He won on his debut. He's the youngest Grand Prix winner.
Yeah, I know, because Chan Onchu is managed by Kenan Softwoglu. That's why he's in World Supersport. And because Chan Onchu isn't as bright as Pedro Acosta. Pedro Acosta seems much more settled, much calmer, much more mature. The same with Fenati. Fenati's talent is phenomenal. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the brain to actually use it. Fenati is too much Andrea Iannone, whereas I think Pedro Acosta looks more like Miguel Oliveira.
Can I just quickly say, before we go on to the next question, we have to remember that for a rider like Iker Lecuona, that kind of second seat, that B seat, if you like, in Tech 3 is the place where a rookie or a young rider needs to be. I think it's pretty, if he was to be in a more higher profile, to be kind, not to be too harsh on Tech 3, then, he would be under far more pressure, far more time constraints to really show what he can do. So, I think he's had a season and a bit maybe if we get into the late summer, he hasn't shown really kind of top 10 potential, then you have to ask questions. But, it's still a bit too soon.
Yeah, pressure is much higher on Petrucci than it is on Lecuona, because Petrucci, he's a known quantity.
I don't think it is though, Dave, because Lecuona is very dispensable. He's a rider that KTM plucked from Moto2. He's obviously super talented. We've seen that all the way through, but it's not enough to be talented in MotoGP now. We always say that. You need to be experienced, you need to have intelligence, you need to be able to understand the bike, you need to be able to set the bike up. All these different factors come into it. And Lecuona was fast-tracked through by KTM in a bit of a flap, really, because of the Zarco situation. And then suddenly he could easily find himself washed out for the precise reasons that Adam say they can keep him. There's no pressure on that seat, which also means they've got nothing to lose by bringing in someone else. It could be a Remy Gardner. Personally, I'd love to see Toprak on the bike. He's Red Bull backed, he's Turkish. It's great for MotoGP to open up that market. He might well be managed by Keenan Sofoglu, Dave. But you know what? Put him on the bike, because he's the fourth KTM, and if it ends up being a disaster, you've risked nothing. I think someone like Toprak is your ultimate boom or bust rider, whereas there's a lot of riders that you can put into those kind of seats that are going to be all right. Toprak could be fantastic, or he could not adapt at all, but he could be one of those riders that's worth taking a chance. And then, like you said, Dave, as well, KTM have got a pipeline of talent. We've already mentioned Remy Gardner. Raul Fernandez could be one of those guys that's a one and done Moto2 rider.
Yeah, but I mean, look, Lecuona's 21. That's the thing. Like, is he 21, 22? He's very, very young. Danilo Petrucci is 31. Petrucci is at the point in his career where he needs to perform, and if he doesn't perform, then he gets kicked out for a young talent with more potential. MotoGP rider selection, a lot of it is about potential. Do you have the potential? We know what Petrucci's potential is. He's won a MotoGP race. If he can't be at that level where he's competing for a win, then I think if he can't show that, then I think he's in trouble, and he's the first one to go, rather than Lecuona, who still has the potential.
Yeah, like at the end of the day, it always comes down to what the ceiling and the floor is. And it's, obviously you look at factory Ducati, someone like Pecco Bagnaia has got a very high ceiling and probably quite a high floor. So you're going to get decent performances out of Pecco whenever he gets himself bedded in. Obviously last year we saw he was still inconsistent, but you look at what he did in Moto2, you're going to have that confidence. And that's obviously what KTM will look to do as well at some point with the Tech 3 team.
Again, not to bounce too much on a tangent, but if you look at the history of Moto2 world champions, there's only every rider bar two is now riding in MotoGP. That's for the better part of 10 years. So I think, you have to be looking at Moto2 and, to win a championship, if that's the barometer or the criteria that you need to be in MotoGP, then that raises all sorts of questions. Is Remy Gardner going to be more valid for Iker Lecuona's seat, or is somebody like Sam Lowes? Because, he's been in MotoGP before, it didn't work out. If he wins the Moto2 Championship again this year, should he deserve to go back into the main class? Maybe I'm being biased, but I think yes. So, there is all sorts of factors coming into the mix-up of saddles. It should be quite a good silly season, actually. Yeah,
and as you mentioned there, Sam Lowes in Moto2, we've got not a Moto2 question from our listeners. We've got a Moto3 question. We'll jump straight to Moto2 before that, just to get your guys' thoughts on what we saw in that race as well. Ad, you picked it as your moment of the weekend. I couldn't really argue too much with it because I thought it was a great race.
Yeah, it was. Sam Lowes was the only 100% man, wasn't he, from both Grand Prix? Okay, again, we've said it was a very particular set of circumstances, very similar. But then again, compared to the start of last year where he was riding injured and there were questions over the fact whether, does he really deserve that place in that team and such billing in Moto2? And by the end of the season, he nailed it. This was a really strong statement, I think, from Sam Lowes. So fingers crossed that he can maintain that level.
And Dave, obviously, you picked Moto3 as your moment, and the pit lane start for Pedro Acosta really sets the scene for what we went on to see. We asked for feedback on Twitter at Paddock Pass Pod for what everyone thought of the Moto3 penalties, and we got lots of feedback. We got, Max tweeted us to say, look, what's the next step for penalties? If a pit lane start isn't enough of a penalty, what do we have to do next? Obviously, we got a bit of an answer for that with John McPhee and Jeremy Alcoba. We got a tweet in from Al, and he said, you know what? They should ditch this. go full Isle of Man TT. Let's have a time trial. Let's have, Superbike, Super Pole sessions. Let's bring that back. Mike was asking, why did the team managers even let this happen? Surely at some point you have to give accountability to a higher degree than just the riders on the bike. And then David Boda basically just said, why can't they learn? Why can't they learn from their mistakes?
Sorry, motorbike riders are learning.
Why do you have to learn from your mistake? If starting from the pit lane, you can still set a race rhythm that's enough to draw you up to the pack and then cut through. I mean, that's the result was. It was such a fantastic spectacle. Not only because it was the typical Moto3 race, but you had that sight of 7 rider. Well, not 7. There was like 2 of them, Fanati and Acosta catching up the group. But then you also had the incident with John McPhee, and it's just kind of there were penalties flying left, right, and centre. I mean, it was. At times it was like a fake wrestling contest or whatever. It was entertaining fare.
I'd just kind of in line with that. You've said this a few times before. Is Moto3 actually entertaining, or is it all just let's get to the last 2 laps?
It is. I mean, look. You have 15 riders all holding each other up. You allow a rider that starts well after. The pack has gone round the first turn to catch up and win the Grand Prix. I mean, it's like some bizarre peloton where everyone's sort of, taking turns to get out in front. And I did wonder actually, during the race, and when we shared it on the WhatsApp group we had between us, but it's a case of, can a rider really make the difference in the category anymore?
Can we just have a criterium race, Dave, where the guy that's at the back of the group just has to drop out of the race every lap, and then suddenly it's like a last man standing battle between the two? Maybe that would be great for how you actually set the grid in Moto3. It'd be carnage, but it would be great.
I still think they should have like in MXGP. They should have they should just have a qualifying race. That would make a lot more. That would actually make a lot more sense because this way. But the point about the penalties is you're not paying. It doesn't matter what you do to the riders because the riders don't care anyway. The riders are always going to go for what they can, and they're doing what the teams tell them. The teams, the people you have to punish are the teams, and until you can find a way to punish the teams, then they will keep telling their riders, you have to go and get a tow. You have to qualify on the front row of the grid or in the front part of the grid.
Well, I really want to hear from the man who has to comment on all the free practice sessions in Moto3 and has to deal with all the penalties and like the kind of rider mentalities. What do you reckon, Neil? Yeah,
you've been very quiet, Neil.
I thought he was saving it. I thought he was saving it for Paddock Pass. Actually, want the specialist sign up for the money.
No, Neil, just tell us about Matt Dunn's hair, please.
It's quite something. It is quite a sight for sore eyes, as my mum would say. I agree with you. I think it's got to the stage where, you're not really learning much about a lot of the guys when you have essentially all of the field bar, 6 or 7 names fighting at the front. You kind of and they're doing lap times that are probably a second and a half off what they're capable of. You wonder like, okay, you're learning a bit of racecraft at the end, but how does this prepare you for Moto2 where you just have to go flat out the whole time? And I think the fact that there is so much ridiculously close racing in Moto3 almost devalues it ever so slightly, because you want the occasional guy to just appear head and shoulders above the rest, I think a couple of runaway victories would actually be a good thing for the class. But Sunday's race was unreal, unbelievable entertainment. I think there are certain team managers that do look at the current incarnation of Moto3 and think this isn't really training my riders as well as what it did 5 or 6 years ago or what 125s did.
I think as well as that, though, we're at a point now with Moto3 where so many of the top guys moved on last year that we're left with a lot of the guys that aren't going to get another opportunity. I'm going to break your heart here. Romano Fenati, he's a Moto3 rider. Antonelli, we saw him really fast during this race, but Antonelli's not going to get another chance at moving up through the classes. He might move to a 600 Supersport bike, but he's not going to get a Moto2 right unless he goes out and wins the championship. John McPhee is at an age where he shouldn't be involved in so many incidents. It doesn't matter if the incidents aren't his fault. There's a reason why you get to that age and you're still in the Moto3 class. So we're at a point where, all these superstars, and that's what, like we talked about in our Moto3 season preview, that's how all of us viewed Pedro Acosta after Red Bull Rookies and CEV last year. We talked about Izan Guevara and the potential he has to jump in and make an impact. He's had 2 top 10 finishes in his first 2 Grand Prix. In normal circumstances, we'd look at a guy coming in and doing that, and we'd wax lyrically about them. Xavi Artigas, he might be rough around the edges, but he's been in the lead group in both the 2 races, and he had a podium in Valencia on his Grand Prix debut a couple of years ago. These guys coming in are ready to make that step, and because Moto3 has a bit of a lack of depth at the top right now for established riders, they're able to get right to the front, and they're able to dictate an awful lot of terms. And I think that's what's kind of playing into this as well right now. There's an awful lot of no man's land in Moto3 right now.
Yeah, just quickly, Steve, following on, we said it before as well that, it shows the level of the CEV and also the Red Bull rookies. A rider like Acosta, I mean, he may be a fantastic talent and go on to bigger and better things, but the fact that he can come in after dominating that series and already shine so well in Moto3 shows the narrowing gap between a Grand Prix class and those kind of filtering or those feeder series. I mean, it's a similar scenario almost in MXGP where you have the MX250 European Championship straight into MX2. There are riders there that are European Championship race winners. They can jump straight into Grand Prix and also have, they'll be vying for race wins. So it's, in a way, like Neil said, there is a kind of devaluation going on.
Yeah, and obviously Pedro Acosta's already a MotoGP rider in waiting. So, the level of these guys
stick him on the Tech 3 bike.
Put him on the factory bike. Put him on the factory bike. Just do it. It's grand. Now, admittedly, he might want to be able to use a digital readout as well during the course of races. So maybe just take your time, but we'll wait and see how he does. But I think, Ad, you're dead right. And it comes down to what we talked about in our preseason shows. The talent level coming through the CEV Championship is higher than ever, really, right now. And the reason for that is, you've got European Talent Cup, you've got Asia Talent Cup, you've got the British Talent Cup, you've got the Northern European Talent Cup now. That's not necessarily where we're getting great riders, but it means that more young riders get opportunities. So you might find one great rider in each of those championships each year. You might find, a couple of great riders that have that potential to then find their way onto a Red Bull Rookies bike or onto a CEV bike. And that's why you've just got lots of talent coming through and really learning their trade. And that's why, whenever you're spending so much time on Grand Prix machinery before you actually move into the Grand Prix paddock, you could have 30 Red Bull Rookie starts, you could have 40 or 50 CEV Moto3 starts. So you've basically got 80 starts on Grand Prix machinery. So yeah, you've got to learn to adapt to new circuits, traveling, new rivals, all that kind of thing. But you've got what would have been the equivalent of 3, 4, maybe even 5 seasons on Grand Prix machinery in the past before you've even made your debut. And that didn't really happen as much in the past. And I think that's what kind of gives these young riders an opportunity. And that's where, if you think back to, let's pick Valentino Rossi. You go back to the mid-90s, someone like Rossi, Goy, that came in during the same time, they were outliers. They were young kids that were immediately able to hit the front from, European 125 championships straight into the world championships. That was quite rare. Whereas now it's much more commonplace because these kids are much more experienced than they were, 15 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and they're riding on, they'll have ridden at all 4 Spanish Grand Prix tracks. They'll have ridden at Portimao, which is now also a Grand Prix track. They'll have ridden at Le Mans, which is also a Grand Prix track, because that's where the CEV FIM, you know the one, the FIM CEV Junior World Championship races.
So close. You
I'm not even going to bother. But they know these tracks already. So that's like six tracks of the what is it, 18 or 19 that they're going to be racing at. So there's so much less to, and they have experience with the machines. They have experience with the teams also, because a lot of they're in feeder teams which get into Moto3. So yeah, the gap between the FIM CEV and Moto3 is not zero, but very, very, very small.
And just quickly again, it's, timing is an opportunity is everything, isn't it? I mean, look at Raul Fernandez jumping straight out of a very good end of Moto3 season with a lot of momentum, and now he was also one of the standout riders in Moto2. Was it the right time for Tony Arbolino to jump straight into Moto2, or Lorenzo Della Porta? These riders who have vaulted into the next category. I mean, you could look at a rider like Pol Espargaro. He was nowhere in his first year in Moto2, and then eventually won the championship. I know now Moto2 is much more of a reduced kind of class in terms of differentiation in machinery with a Calac chassis, but again, just the factor of what saddle is open to you and what opportunity is open to you can really make or break a career, or at least save you a couple of years. Story of racing.
Yeah, exactly, Dave. And I think that the likes of Della Porta, it's very easy to forget. He was a world champion. He did a great job. And you do make that move then into the intermediate class. It's very rare that you get a rider that sticks around in the introductory class like Manuel Poggiali, that stuck around to retain or to defend his world championship, and then obviously moved on to a 250 and won a world championship as a rookie. That's quite rare. And those riders are now under pressure to progress all the way through. And it kind of brings us into where we are right now. And that's why, just before we finish up tonight, I want to just have it where we all give our winners and losers from the weekend, because there's so many guys we can pick for winners, and there's so many guys that we can pick as well on the flip side of that. And that could be across all three classes as well, because there's just so much to talk about. That's why, we've been on for an hour and a half, and we've still got Paddock Pass Podcast Extra to record as well, just for our Patreon supporters. So it shows just how much news there is in the Grand Prix paddock right now. But Dave, I'm going to come to you for your winner over the course of the Doha Grand Prix.
I think my winner is KTM because, as I said, because of their talent pool. They just have so much talent. They fixed some of their problems in MotoGP. Brad Binder had a fantastic race. I think the best result and closest result ever at Qatar. Remy Gardner, Raul Fernandez, Pedro Acosta, Jaume Masia. The future, the future is bright. The future is orange, to steal an advertising slogan from someone else.
Yeah, Dave, obviously you're going to pick KTM as your losers as well, because they're going to have to give up some of those riders going forward as well. Neil, what about you? Who's your big winner from the Doha Grand Prix?
Similar theme to Dave, but I'm going to go with Brad Binder, just because it was so unexpected. We had almost written KTM off in MotoGP as not going to really be able to achieve anything, but they took that medium front tire gamble, and Brad just rode like an absolute champ, rode like an animal, salvaged a top 10 finish, overtook two people in the last lap, 8th place, less than 6 seconds off, I think 12 or 13 seconds faster from race 1 to race 2. Yeah, Binder.
I think you're really going to struggle to pick another KTM rider, are you?
No, I was going to say a team, Red Bull KTM AO, but they've already did it. No, my winner has to be Johan Zarco. Leaving the first two races as leader of the MotoGP World Championship. I'm sure that every time he kind of passes a KTM or he's racing a KTM, he either must be thinking, thank God I got off that thing, or, did I really almost sink my career by taking a big paycheck and not really carrying the right attitude into that project? But, now you can't argue with the bike he's got beneath him or the job that he's doing.
Yeah, and I tell you what, I can't really argue with any of those. But for me, my big winner of the weekend, I said this last night in Paddock Notes, and I'm going to say it again, my big winner was actually Sam Lowes, because I think it's impressive when any rider that's established in the Grand Prix paddock, and Sam's won a lot of races, he's been a front runner for a long time, he's a world champion in the Supersport class, but any time that a rider that we know how good they can be goes out and has the best race that we've ever seen from them, I think deserves kudos. And that's taken into account races where Sam ran away from the field in Moto2, and I thought his performance yesterday, just to soak up that pressure, was so impressive. And going into the last corner, I think everyone thought Remy was just going to shove it down the inside, but it came down to just how late Sam could brake. And then as well, he's adjusted his riding style. We talked about it in the Moto2 season preview, using that scooter rear brake, and that really allowed him to get the bike stopped, not give up the corner, and then get the win. So for me, he was my big winner. But Ad, if there's winners, there's always losers. And who was your big loser from the weekend?
I'm not sure if I'm going to contradict myself from what I said earlier, but the loser for me is Valentino Rossi. Is this the beginning of the end? That's it, really.
Yeah, and it's fair enough as well. Like we said earlier on, this is a historical moment, the worst qualifying performance of Rossi's career, tough race weekend, and this could be the moment we look back on and think, yeah, that was the turn. I don't think it's going to be a moment that we look back and put down as a footnote on Rossi's career. We'll forget that he qualified 21st pretty quickly, but hard to argue with that. Dave, what about you?
I mean, it's tempting to say to just agree completely with Adam, because this was just horrendous for Valentino Rossi. But I'm going to say that for if he's 21st at Mugello. So I think I'm going to go with Jack Miller, because Jack Miller leaves Qatar as the fourth Ducati in the standings behind his factory teammate and the two Pramac Ducatis. And he leaves frustrated. He leaves to go and get arm pump surgery, and he's going to need more than at least one race to recover from arm pump surgery. So, and he goes to Portimao as well, which is a right-hand circuit, which is not good for having to recover from arm pump surgery. So, yeah, I think it was a bad weekend for Jack Miller and not what he was expecting, especially coming out of the test.
Neil, what about you? I think I'm going to have to go with John McPhee, just because he came into the Moto3 season as one of the preseason favourites. He has to really fight for the championship this year, and he's essentially, barring kind of a minor miracle, he's going to leave round 3 of the season with no points to his name, which is just staggering. The guy just can't catch a break at the moment. The fisticuffs in the sand trap afterwards were mildly entertaining. Obviously not for him, but just because John is such a nice and mild-mannered guy, to see him lose his head like that, how raging and furious and frustrated he must have been. It's not looking, the situation for the championship isn't looking good for him at the moment. Pretty bad.
Yeah, and again, tough to argue with that. And I actually, I'll be honest, I was going to pick John for mine. But instead, as you were talking there, Dave, as you were talking there, Ad, and then obviously what Neil said, I'm actually just going to pick the whole Petronas team, because this was, such a difficult weekend for so many of their riders. We saw McPhee obviously have that issue in Moto3. We saw, Jake Dixon and Javi Vieira struggling in Moto2. Obviously, Dixon in particular with his injuries. And then we saw Morbidelli and Rossi down the order at a track where Yamaha has won both races this season. So for me, Petronas were the big losers this weekend. And that's even taking into account what Darren Binder was able to do in the Moto3 race.
Yeah, I was going to say Darren Binder is second in the championship and has been a very, very consistent. So, hats off to what Darren Binder. He's the only light point in that, or bright point in that team at the moment.
I would also like to apologise to all the listeners that we won't have any interviews from any of the Petronas riders across the classes in the next few weeks. But never mind, we'll find somebody else.
And we're 90 minutes into the show. There's no way that a team press officer is listening this long. We're going to be fine. We're 90 minutes into this show. We've still got Paddock Pass Podcast Extra to record as well. That's just for our Patreon supporters. So for all Patreon supporters, we give them an extra show. And that's every week we record an extra show just to be able to give them something for their $3 a month. We also have a Paddock Insiders tier as well. That's $10 a month, and that's where we give our Paddock notes. And we're also going to offer some live streams as well for our Paddock Insiders, where they'll be able to join us as we record and basically ping us questions, and we can use different formats for that show. So we got lots of different ways on patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast for you to support the podcast, and far more than supporting it, you get lots of content for what you're able to put up as well. So big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for the support that they have given us over the course of the last couple of months, and a big thank you to David Emmett, Neil Morrison and Adam Wheeler for joining us on the Paddock Pass Podcast this week, and a big thank you to everyone for listening.
This episode of the Paddock Pass Podcast was produced by Jensen Beeler, David Emmett, Steve English, Neil Morrison, and Adam Wheeler. It was edited by Brian Burnett. Music is provided by The Liberty. All inquiries can be sent via email to team@paddockpasspodcast.com.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough to really put your finger on. Franco,
You're muted,
wasn't-
Neil. You're muted, Neil.
Sorry, lad. Sorry, Brian. If you could maybe just edit that a little bit out.